Now, let me ask again. Are you sure we're ready to go? Just checking, just to make sure that everyone was alert? Okay. Let me know, guys, when I'm live on the live stream. Okay. Hi, everyone, and good evening. My name is Ricardo Alfaro. I am chair of Agenda Alexandria, and I want to thank everyone joining us online, everyone who's also joining us here at the George Washington Masonic National Memorial. This is our second in-person program of the year, and we're really thrilled to be starting to come back in person. Tonight's program is particularly timely. It's called City of Alexandria versus Commonwealth of Virginia, New Governing Dynamics. And it's been a program that I really, truly appreciate the board, especially for being really open to the idea of doing this program in a very timely fashion. For those of you who did not catch it last Wednesday, we had our podcast, our preview podcast on the agenda, where we had CJ Jordan, the former campaign manager for now Lieutenant Governor Winsome Sears, join us. So if you have not already, please take a listen. It's available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Tonight's program, again, I'll let Rod introduce the panelists here in a second, but before doing so, I want to thank our presenting sponsors, McInerney and Associates, Simpson Development, and the Zebra newspaper. I want to also thank our sustaining members, and please bear with me because in a good way, we have a lot of sustaining members. And by the way, for those watching us online, you can also become a sustaining member and have your name listed here at our next April program if you go to agendaalexandria.org and become a sustaining member today. So I want to thank Eileen Ahern, Linda and Steve Abb, David Baker, Janet Barnett, Henry Brooks, Nick Carosi, Lee Carosi-Dunn, Bill Dickinson, Frank Fannin, Oscar Fitzgerald, Jenny Franco, Chris Lewis, Mary Harris, Val Hawkins, Rudd Kukrow, Michael Pope, Anne Rector, Elizabeth Seltzer, David Specs, and Pat Turgas. Thank you to all of them for being a sustaining member. And again, if you are not already a sustaining member and if you want your name listed here, please remember to go to agendaalexandria.org and become a sustaining member today. So I want to thank everyone again for coming here tonight. I please will bear with us, both the people here in the audience and the people online. We're still kind of like going back to this dynamic of, it's kind of like you haven't ridden a bicycle in a while and you're kind of like getting acquainted again to how the dynamic was. So I appreciate everyone, and when everyone's ready up there, please roll the intro.
2022 program for Agenda Alexandria. We are live tonight in the theater of the George Washington Masonic National Memorial on top of Shooters Hill in Alexandria. My name is Rod Kukrow. I'm the Vice Chairman of Agenda Alexandria, and I will be moderating tonight's session. Agenda Alexandria is a more than 20-year-old organization where we take a look at issues without taking sides. Tonight, as Ricardo mentioned, our topic is really fresh since the November election. It's called the City of Alexandria versus the Commonwealth of Virginia, New Governing Dynamics. Before November's election, Democrats controlled both the state Senate and the House of Delegates, as well as the offices of Governor, Lieutenant Governor, and Attorney General. But voters in November decided they wanted Republicans to take power, and the Democrats now only control the state Senate. The Republicans have the House of Delegates, and voters chose Glenn Youngkin as governor, Winsome Sears as lieutenant governor, and Jason Miyares as Attorney General. Notably, Winsome Sears is the first African-American woman to be elected statewide, and Jason Miyares is the first Latino to be elected statewide, both Republicans. As we look ahead, it's almost inevitable that the relationship between the Democratic leadership in Alexandria and surrounding counties that tend to be blue counties and cities, and the Commonwealth is going to change somewhat in the next couple of years. Late last year, the mayor of Alexandria, Justin Wilson, outlined areas of potential common ground with then Governor-elect Youngkin. He sent a letter on December 22nd. One of the areas he suggested for collaboration was the preservation and expansion of local authority for Alexandria and other jurisdictions. However, since taking office, that is Governor Youngkin, we've now seen actual disagreements start to play out regarding policy and executive orders, most notably with the state budget not having been approved on time, and I believe the legislature is coming back on Monday to try to work out an agreement on the state budget and some other related issues. So as the city and statewide leadership find themselves often at odds pertaining to certain topics, how will local and state governments work together? To get some insight into these questions, we have a great panel tonight, and they are from my right, your left, starting at the end, is Mark Levine. Mark is a former delegate from the city of Alexandria. For 6 years, he served in the House of Delegates. He also has a syndicated radio show, which he was well known for before that. Next to him is Sarah Taylor. Sarah is the city's legislative director, essentially the city's top lobbyist in Richmond. Next to Sarah is Michael Liser. Michael is, lobbyist is not a dirty word on this stage, essentially the lobbyist in Northern Virginia for the Family Foundation, which is a conservative, I'd say, think tank, social movement group that has sort of principles that are quite well known. They've been around for decades now, right? And then finally next to me is Michael Ginsberg, who is a vice president of the CACI International, but he's here tonight because he's been a longtime activist in Republican politics statewide. I believe you're formerly chairman of the 8th District Republican Committee and are now running for chairman of the 11th District Committee? Yep. What happened? You moved?
I moved out.
Okay, moved out, all right.
Moved west.
Okay, well, to start out tonight, I'm going to ask each one of our panelists, starting at the end with Mark, to spend no more than 5 minutes, and I will sort of time that, to sort of give us your views on what this new election, the election results may mean, and what kind of dynamic we'll be looking at. Obviously, you're speaking from the perspective of having been there during a time when there were only Democratic governors, correct?
That's correct.
So what, if you had a crystal ball, what's the future look like for this dynamic?
Well, I don't think actually it's that new and different. I wasn't in the House of Delegates when McDonald was there, but there was a time when the Republicans controlled both the governor's mansion and the House and the Senate, and those were certainly some tough times that I can talk about. But you know, I spent 4 years under a Republican speaker in the House of Delegates and Republican-controlled Senate. And so I know well the dynamics between wanting local control and not. You know, when I first learned about what conservatives were, I had heard that conservatives believe in local control, that the elected officials closest to the people should be able to decide these things. That's a load of hooey. That isn't true at all, at least not true in Virginia. I guarantee you the Republicans do not want local control for Alexandria. They want power, and if they control the state levers, they will use that power. And so one of the things I found interesting, and this continued, at least for me, from my voting record, from Republican control well into Democratic control, is I always voted for local control. Actually, I cast thousands of votes, probably dozens for local control, and only one exception I did not. Because, I mean, I was one of 5 delegates that voted to let the Harrisonburg city decide its own fire code, because I just don't think that Richmond should be deciding things like that. So I've been pretty consistent, but the battles have been about that power, and there is a feeling about Northern Virginia among Republicans that is not very kind, and you should know that. And a lot of these battles come out, some very publicly, some privately, on everything from towing ordinances to our CSO money, our combined sewer money, where Alexandria originally got a pretty raw deal, not so much for environmental reasons, but because I think of the partisan dynamics, to this budget right now. In fact, we're still fighting over the CSO money in this very budget. But one of the things that we fought over is just our rights to local control. I know one of my bills that the Republicans tried to repeal this year was a bill to allow local control of gun regulation. Some of you may remember I actually had a man with a gun appear outside my home, in the park outside my home, to threaten me. And that was legal at the time. It was not legal by the time I and some of my colleagues had passed a bill to make it illegal. But the reason it was illegal was not because we banned guns in parks throughout Virginia. No, we allowed localities to make that decision, and the city council thankfully decided to ban them in Alexandria. So I'm a firm believer in local control. Forget the stereotype of, you know, Democrats, Republicans. And I wish there was more of that, because I find that that generally a lot of the Republicans I deal with. Now, when it comes to their own districts, their own regions, they do believe in local control. But we've had issues, for example, with regard to judges. The general rule in the General Assembly is that every locality gets to pick their judges. But there was a time when Tim Hugo didn't like that the Fairfax delegation picked certain judges that the Fairfax delegation wanted, because he said, nope, Republicans are in control. I get to decide a judge. So these are battles that have been going on a long time. Now with Youngkin, the two main things that people are talking about are critical race theory and masks. And it'll be interesting to see where it all goes. If a teacher in Alexandria teaches about slavery, and some parent uses the Youngkin tip line to say that's an inherently divisive topic, I don't want my son to feel guilty about race, then one of the things that Youngkin could do is threaten to harm Alexandria. We saw this, by the way, with the mask mandate. I know my time's running out quickly, but there was a law that said we were going to follow the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. And that meant that when the CDC wanted us to wear masks, kids had to wear masks. Well, Youngkin said, nope, I'm going to have an executive order. Kids don't have to wear masks in school if we don't say so. Well, what happened is there were court battles, and we were right. That was the way the law was. Now the law was changed. But in the midst of that court battle, something very interesting happened. Youngkin said that any school that disobeyed his executive order, even though they were required by law to disobey it, would be punished. He would withdraw money, he said, from Northern Virginia budgets. Now, he has no power to do that. The way the governor's budget works is he can rescind certain provisions of it, but very few provisions are locality-centric. The sewer would be an example, but there aren't that many. He can't just pick out and say, we're not funding Alexandria schools, we're not funding Arlington schools. It was an empty threat, but it was a scary one to say that he was going to single out a jurisdiction. Anyway, I look forward to your questions, and looking forward to going into more detail on all of this. Thanks.
Sarah, tell us a little bit about how long you've been with the city, exactly what your job entails. Obviously, the legislature meets generally for about 6 weeks a year. Maybe they go back, as they're going back next week for a wrap-up session and mop up things they didn't get done. But the rest of the year, the other, what's my math, 46 weeks, things that Mark described are going on at the governor's office level, at the attorney general's level, and the various departments. So how do you spend your time, and how do you decide, and how does the council tell you to decide what to make a priority?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me. As you mentioned, I am the city's legislative director. I am the city's lobbyist. I'm not the city's top lobbyist. I'm the city's only lobbyist. So top or bottom, I'm the only one. And so you're right. I mean, I go to Richmond every year for either 45 or 60 days, depending on whether it's a short session or a long session. And the idea that we call 60 days to do a budget and policy a long session is an interesting choice of words. But I do go down there. I leave after my kids are asleep on Friday night. Or on Sunday night, spend the week down there, come home hopefully in time for Pizza Friday. I've been with the city here. This was my 5th session here with the city, my 5th regular session. I've had a couple special sessions. The more of them we have, the less special they get. But in my time here, I've been in Republican majorities, I've been in Democratic majorities, I've been in split majorities. Before I came here to Alexandria, I worked in the Oklahoma legislature, where I was chief of staff to the Democrats in the Oklahoma Senate. First of all, there are Democrats in the Oklahoma Senate. There were 7 of a 48-member body. So I kind of don't know how to do this job without figuring out ways to creatively message issues, find partners and stakeholders, identify ways to talk about issues in a way that cross geographic boundaries as well as partisan boundaries and all of that. And that's really what I do year-round. Sure, during the other 46 weeks of the year, I'm working with the community and departments and council and folks on what are our priorities for the next year, what are we going to support for the next year, what legislative proposals are we going to put on the table, work with members of our delegation to identify what might be palatable, what they might be interested in carrying, what stakeholders we bring together. But a huge part of it is the relationship building piece of it, because when I show up in Richmond, I want folks to know that I'm not just a Northern Virginia progressive community partisan hack. I'm really not. And when you look at the city's legislative package, I think it really does present our priorities in a way that it sort of follows on that Fiorello LaGuardia line of, there's no Democratic or Republican way to plow a street or clear a road. That's really what the city's legislative package is intended to do. It's intended to look at the services that are core to our community, that we as a city are trying to deliver, whether it's to our businesses, our residents, our visitors, the streets, the sidewalks, transit, our infrastructure, how safe are our schools, how do we deal with vulnerable populations. And while Alexandria may view some of these issues through lenses that may be partisan, equity or race and social justice or other issues like that, at its core, what my job down there is to make sure that we have the money, the authority, the legal standing, the regulation, whatever it is, to be able to deliver the services that are core to our community to everyone in our community. And so again, whether that's finding $40 million in the budget for our CSO project or $500,000 in the budget for the flood, to deal with the flooding issues at Douglas Memorial Cemetery, or legislation that would allow us to share data records to better serve kids who are currently being served by both the juvenile justice system and the child welfare system. What I do crosses lots of issue areas, but at its core is really intended to be about the delivery of core government services. And that is the place where we can find partnership, whether it's with Republicans or geographic partners, issues that really do cross communities across the Commonwealth. There is rarely an issue that is so unique to the city of Alexandria that we are the only ones who care about it. And so my job is to find others who care about these things and find these other folks to bring on board, Republicans, Democrats, progressives, conservatives, rural, urban, suburban, and find those folks to come together and say, inland flooding is a major issue that doesn't just affect Alexandria. And here are all these other communities that are represented by Republicans and Democrats across the Commonwealth who we can all come together to come up with progressive ways. And I mean that in that there are steps towards achieving these goals, that progress is a series of steps, and finding those steps, finding the partners to take those steps with you, as small as they might be depending on the partisan breakdown of the legislature. That's what my job is, to figure out how to take those small steps towards the goals we're trying to achieve. And building those relationships and being someone that people want to work with, and coming at this from a very practical and thoughtful place. That's really what my job is. And it's why I really love this job. I mean, Delegate Levine's right. These problems are best solved at the level closest to the problem. And that's where I am, and that's what we like to do in Richmond.
Good. Thank you, Sarah. Michael, you must have, once the election results shook out the days after Election Day, you must have thought, I'm living in a dream here. But in previous years, you've had to work essentially with a Democratic legislature, Democratic governors. Both Sarah and Mark talked about the relationships, the need for sort of working across the aisle to solve problems that are common to people from both parties. Yeah. Nevertheless, the Family Foundation has an agenda you'd like to see pursued. How do you balance pursuing that agenda with sort of trying to help maybe get Democrats in the House of Delegates to see some issues the way you want them to see it?
Well, I think, so many people on both sides of the aisle wait till our guys get in. Or let's wait for our guys to get in. And then nothing hardly ever gets done. And I think as the Family Foundation, we're beholden to the people who we represent to do as much as possible with what we're presented with. And I like what Sarah talked about before about relationship building. I think it's important. It's important to build relationships with people who you disagree with. You may disagree with like 90% of the time. That doesn't mean you're an enemy. That means that you're a 10% ally on issues that might be very important. I'll give you an example. A couple years ago, the General Assembly passed a resolution allowing certain localities in Virginia to open casinos if localities decide to do so. Danville, Portsmouth, Norfolk, Bristol, in 2020, all approved casinos. At the Family Foundation, one of the issues, our target issues, is what we call human exploitation. So we're concerned about drug use, we're concerned about casinos, and we think they can take advantage of those who are lower income, lower middle class individuals and families. And we're all about, trying to build up families and trying to help them reach the socio and economic prosperity that we believe that they can. So last year, Richmond had a referendum on a casino. And we actually had some people come to us, people we've never worked with before, more on the liberal progressive side, had some of the same concerns these are hurting minorities, these are hurting, this casino has the potential to do a lot of harm. We worked together behind the scenes, did a little marketing, grassroots work, and we surprised everybody by defeating the referendum in Richmond. I think that's just so important. We had I'll give you an instance. We had another instance. We, of course, were happy about the mass optional provision in the legislature that came down, and local Senator Chet Peterson was instrumental in helping get that through. About a month ago, we had a parental rights lobby day in Richmond. Had a bunch of Northern Virginia people with me. We went up to Chet Peterson's office. He wasn't there at the time, but we talked to his LA, and we said, thank you for giving parents this option. And we try to make it a point at the Family Foundation, too, for people who normally disagree with us on a lot of issues. If they do something that we like, and we will thank them, we'll give them public credit for that. Senator Joe Morrissey agrees with us about 30% of the time on our issues, but he's all very strongly pro-life. When the session started, he invited us to our office. We talked about different legislation that he could support, that he might not support, and so forth. And we were thankful for some of the statements he made. We actually invited him a couple weeks ago to talk to some of our advisory council members and say, so he could stand up and say, yes, I'm with you on these issues, and so our people could see that. Even though we disagree with him about at least 2/3 of the time, I think that's really important. And another thing I'll say too is that we don't take a lot of public positions on issues, but if you really want to get things done, you need to have those personal contacts, whether it's on the phone or just in person. It's just so important. I'll give you another example. We were talking to, I'll give you one example of a personal contact here. We had Senator Eben, who disagrees with us on a lot of different issues. We were at a hearing on the marijuana commercialization legislation. And one of our chief lobbyists, Dr. Todd Gackey, was talking about some of the connections between increased drug use and suicide among young teens, and mentioned how one of his son's teammates recently committed suicide. Senator Eben called up the next day. I mean, the marijuana legislation was defeated, called up the next day and wanted to see how his son's faring. Those types of personal relationships, we really do try to cultivate those. And I'm sorry, did I go over my 5 minutes here? Okay. And so there's a lot of different things I think you can do and that you should do to just try to build those relationships. It's surprising what you can do. I'll take one step out of politics here. For about 10 years, I worked with a group dealt with policy and culture, the Clapham Group. We actually were involved in some film production. We produced films that were, I would say, faith-informed versus faith-based. Faith-based being strictly for a Christian audience, where faith-informed had Christian elements to it, but for more of a mainstream audience. We had an opportunity to invest in Martin Scorsese's silence film, and we did. Several strong Christians. We brought in some groups like the Green family, the Hobby Lobby family, invested in a Martin Scorsese film. Now, we wouldn't have invested in The Wolf of Wall Street or some other films like that, but this was a product, this story about these Jesuit priests in Japan asked some really deep questions, some thoughtful questions. We thought this would be great for a large audience. Of course, so did Scorsese, but he had a hard time getting the funding for it. We helped him with that. And so just because you disagree with someone in so many different issues, there's ways you can find to work with people that will move the ball forward for everybody. And I think that's just so important to look at those ways that you can work together. You'll be surprised at what you can do.
Thank you, Michael. It was a great movie, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Coming from a Jesuit-educated man, it really hit the note right. Michael, so your background is in working in local politics, going out and going door to door, getting voters to turn out, strategizing. How does this new leadership at the top in the House of Delegates, what does that portend for the issues that you're going to be working for in the 11th District, whether you become chairman or not?
Sure. Thank you again. And I echo, thank you all for being here. Really appreciate the opportunity, invitation to join you tonight. This is a great group, and it's a great topic, so I'm really very happy to be here. I think this election really, as a personal matter, given I'm a Republican activist, it was invigorating. It was exciting for us to, after several years of not having won elections, A statewide election really was invigorating and exciting for us and very welcome. But one of the things that I took away from this, and it's something that Republican activists in Northern Virginia learned very quickly, is that in order to win an election for us, we really need to find issues that have broad-based appeal, that have appeal to across the spectrum, really, coming at a bipartisan approach. And one of the things that struck me about working with Governor Youngkin and Governor Youngkin's team and Jason Miyares and Winsome Sears was that they really seemed to be, they brought that same mindset, that they were looking for that kind of common ground on issues. A lot of these issues that his election really represented for us, sort of the vindication of that philosophy, whether it was, on issues like, in my view, CRT, issues like the masking mandate. I mean, his big issue, another big issue that he was very big on was the charter schools. Bringing more charter schools, more governor schools. He called it his down payment on improving education. And from where I sit, where I've got 2 young kids, and I really do believe, especially the last couple of years, that the lockdowns, the shutdowns, all of that has had a profound effect, particularly on low-income minority communities. And I think he recognized that. And so I think that, where I sit, there are some real opportunities for us to work together, for folks to work with Governor Youngkin, across the aisle. I mean, I view that as a major civil rights issue, and I think he does too, and he said that. And so, as an activist, look, I come at this as a partisan activist, but one who sees the opportunity that, and I think the governor's campaign really proved this, is that when you can reach across the aisle and find that sort of middle ground, and particularly try to find those middle ground, even if you don't always find it, finding those issues, I think, for selfishly, paid a lot of dividends from us from a political perspective, but I think it also set up the sort of laid markers for where we can get things done in Richmond. And the other thing, I mean, this is another thing that a lot of us activists will tell you is Governor Youngkin is a man of some ambition. I don't think this is going to be his last elected office. And I think he would love to have the opportunity to be able to prove to voters that I can work across the aisle and I can get things done with both sides, whether it's So I guess I say that, and I guess I'll make this my last point. That's an opportunity for all of us to take advantage of, that he's looking for opportunities to do that, and we ought to take advantage of that opportunity. The door is open for bipartisan progress.
Thank you, Mike. That reminds me that when Senator Warner was then Governor Warner and running for governor and then running for senator, one thing he was always proud of talking about is his instances where he worked across the aisle with Republicans to do certain things that he thought were good for the state versus good for the party. This is a good time to remind our audience, both here and at home, that if you want to ask questions, we take them, and we'll ask as many as we can. There should be someone in the auditorium here with a pad of paper that walk around, and you can write your questions and send them up to me, and people online can submit them online, and they'll eventually make their way here to the podium. We have about 35 minutes left. I'm going to ask our guests to answer questions quickly because I've got quite a few of them. The first one I want to ask about, though, is this local control. You've heard it talked about tonight by several of our panelists. Many of you may be aware, but those who aren't government wonks may not be, is that the state operates under something called the Dillon Rule, D-I-L-L-O-N. It's only about 4 or 5 states in the country operate under this rule. And essentially, all authority in the state is ceded to the state government, and localities can't do anything at all, for the most part, unless they go to the state for permission. A good example is last year, the city of Alexandria in Arlington County and Fairfax County went to the state because they wanted to be able to place a 5-cent tax on plastic bags. They couldn't do that on their own. They had to be debated in the legislature and signed by the governor, and eventually it was by Governor Northam. But this issue of local control is interesting, and I think Mark brought it up first because if you look at national politics, at least on Congress, I mean, Congress wants Republicans in Congress want all decisions to be pushed down as far as possible to the state governments. But it seems that that's the opposite dynamic here. And I guess I want to ask Michael or Mike to talk about that, because you'd think that if localities want to do certain things because that's what their voters want, and in Alexandria we elected an all-Democratic city council and mayor, we've been doing that for a long time now, why shouldn't they be able to do something without having to come to Richmond hat in hand asking for permission?
I think that's a good question. I mean, speaking for myself, I am kind of a small government conservative. I'm like closer to locality, I think in general principle. I agree with Mark on this, and from that perspective. I think as much as possible, it makes sense that, if local governments can take care of, they know their people. People of Alexandria know their people better than, necessarily all of Northern Virginia, or certainly the state. So, that might be a popular, opinion among Republicans here, but I just think that that is a conservative principle, I think, and I would support something like that going forward.
Sarah, when you're down in Richmond making arguments on behalf of the legislative package the city's put forth, is there a lot of discussion about the Dillon Rule and local control?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I always joke that, that going to Richmond in a Dillon Rule state, and first of all, the Dillon Rule is job security for me. Like home rule states, like localities don't have lobbyists because they have all the authority they want unless the legislature wants to preempt them, and preemption's a thing. But Dillon Rule's kind of job security for me. But that being said, when you're in Richmond and you're asking for permission to do something that your community truly wants from you, I will never understand why a legislator from far southwest Virginia cares one iota about something that we want to do here in Alexandria. Like, why do you care if we want to require somebody purchasing a home in a historic district to purchase a survey of their property because historic district property lines are wonky and we don't want you building your house into your neighbors or into an alley or into an easement? Why would you care if it's something that's only going to happen up here in Plain District 8? Or that would be a local option, and your locality would never do it, but ours really wants it. I have that breakdown every session.
What answer do they give you?
It is generally that there is not much of an appetite for a patchwork of regulation and authority across the Commonwealth. And that generally applies to like business regulations. Why should a business that's in Fairfax County be regulated differently than a business that is in Prince William County, which historically has been more conservative, or Prince William and Spotsylvania County? Why should somebody purchasing a home up here have a different requirement than some? And so that idea of a patchwork, and when it comes to issues like some of the more conservative, especially socially conservative issues, when it comes to gun control. When we talked about the local authority to regulate firearms on public properties, it was, well, what if I'm a visitor and I have my constitutional right to own and carry firearms, and I cross from Spotsylvania into Prince William, and all of a sudden I become a felon through no fault of my own other than the fact that I crossed the line. And there has to be signage and there has to be these things, but that idea of this patchwork of regulation and law and that is where where people tend to get to have feelings about it.
But Mark, most states have that that patchwork that Sarah describes. I mean, Connecticut has hundreds of little small towns, and they all have different laws. And you can cross a border in half a mile and be in a whole other country for most part. When you were in Richmond, well, let me ask you this question. So one of the things Mayor Wilson asked of Governor Youngkin was, in terms of local control, was to allow the city to raise revenue on it. So right now the city raises revenue, I think, by personal property tax and property tax, and that's pretty much it, aside from maybe some meals taxes. But there's no other big chunk of money where the city can look for revenue gains. And the mayor, I think, talked about maybe a sales tax or a tax that would help fund school construction. Obviously, the big elephant in the room has always been a local income tax. I mean, when you were down in Richmond, if something like that came from a jurisdiction like Alexandria, I know.
The answer is no. From Republicans. Look, let me give you some real life examples that we've dealt with the 6 years I was in office. The biggest one was Metro. And this predates my time there. We in Northern Virginia, not just Alexandria, but Arlington and Fairfax, want a dedicated funding stream. Every other subway in the country has a dedicated funding stream. Metro never knew where its last dime was coming from. And so they said, look, we want to tax only Northern Virginians. In fact, I'll tell you who we wanted to tax, and there is one other big source of income other than property tax. It's the Transient Occupancy Tax, the TOT. This is a great tax because we tax people who visit us. They stay in our hotels. No one in Alexandria really stays in an Alexandria hotel very often, but people who visit us do, and they pay taxes and on their rooms, and it's a great way to fund our metro because they actually use our metro a lot as well. And we said, let us use our own funds and our own visitors and pay for our own metro. And the Republicans said, no, we may be visiting you someday, some said. Others said, we just don't believe in taxes. But, I mean, it gets silly. Just this year, Governor Youngkin, he's only done one veto so far. His only veto was Arlington County wanted to be able to have their county board have an auditor for their citizen review board for police. And they wanted to appoint them themselves rather than have the city manager appoint one. Because the county manager appoints both the police chief and the auditor, and they said it's a little too cozy. We want to have separation. It's a very, I mean, if you're bored by me saying this, it's a very internal Arlington type discussion. And that's the only bill so far Governor Youngkin has vetoed, letting Arlington choose how to pick its auditor for the Citizen Review Board of Police. And I have to tell you something, Rod. I firmly believe that if it was Lynchburg or Galax, they would have no problems. So some of this is a Northern Virginia animus that occurs among many Republicans, and that's just there. And listen, I'm against any of this animus. I know the Republicans that say we're real Virginia, and there's Northern Virginia, and there's some Democrats that say there's Northern Virginia and rest of Virginia. So, but I mean, when I was there, I worked with Amanda Chase. I worked with Matt Ferris to do some pretty amazing things. A lot of people don't even want to talk to Amanda Chase, and we got transparency done. So we can work across the aisle, but we have to get rid of a lot of this animus. And a lot of local control comes down to not local control versus state control, which is all highfalutin principles, but which locality's asking.
Mike, is Mark overstating this? Or I remember when Senator Patsy Ticer was in the Senate when she was alive, she used to joke that she would be kidded by Republicans in the Senate as representing the People's Republic of Alexandria. And because of that perception, that label, it was harder for her to get things done. I mean, you've been active at the state level in politics. Is this sort of a gotcha really happening, or is Mark overplaying that?
I mean, I think some of that is true. I mean, I think that there is, you certainly see that in just the political activity I'm involved with. People have a different view of Northern Virginia than they do of Southwest or South Side or what have you. There definitely is I guess in the case of Republicans, we're dragging you across the finish line kind of feel to it. So that there is that division exists. I mean, I do think some of it is concern about principle issues. I mean, gun control is an issue that, people feel strongly about just in principle, and so that's an issue where I can sort of understand why, even though you're down, some far away from Alexandria, you might say, look, this is a matter of constitutional principle, and I'm not going to support that. So I can certainly see arguments where that are maybe sort of more fundamental rather than very in the weeds and very local, where you can say, I can understand why somebody doesn't want, the sort of the camel's nose in the tent, right? It happens in Alexandria, it happens here. If you
That's
a
slope.
metaphor that's rarely often used.
Yeah, that slippery slope.
exactly.
Like the
Exactly.
nun saying, if I let you do it, I have to let everybody else do it.
Right.
Right.
So that's why I think, so I think there's probably, some of it is probably animus, some of it is probably, ideological principle, and you get that collision.
Sarah, so you've talked about sort of right now your immediate concern and what you're watching is how the budget plays out. But the rest of the year, what I talked about earlier, those other weeks of the year, when other things can be happening at the state government, are there certain things that you and the mayor and the council and the new city manager are really concerned about keeping an eye on? One example might be the new attorney general and the governor, frankly, have expressed a desire to try to push the envelope when it comes to the attorney general overseeing the work of local law enforcement, particularly the Commonwealth's attorney's offices. based on the idea that some Commonwealth attorneys may be a little too lenient on certain kinds of crime, or they have different priorities in terms of how they're going to enforce crimes that come before them. I mean, do you share any of those concerns? And if so, can you tell us what they are?
Well, I mean, I think Commonwealth attorneys are constitutionally elected officers, and they are elected by the people, and they have, they make choices, and we obviously work very closely with our Commonwealth Attorney Brian Porter, who is an incredible partner with us on our issues related to criminal justice reform and sort of the principles that the city holds, that our council holds, and that our constituents hold as far as those issues go. But I think during the interim, I spend a lot of time, and our staff are blessed subject matter experts in the city departments who are the real subject matter experts on all these things. I'm a subject matter expert on the process, on the General Assembly, on how to get things done. They're the subject matter experts on the actual work, and so I rely a lot on them. And so during the interim, we spend a lot of time, engaging with the governor's office, engaging with members of the General Assembly, engaging with the myriad work groups and special subcommittees and joint committees on all the things that we really care about. Because I think, like you mentioned, there's a lot of work that gets done behind closed doors. And there's a lot of work that gets done in the off season, as I like to call it. And so that work during the off season to lay the foundation for issues, to bring together stakeholders, to have real working conversations about, okay, like we're not all on the same page on how to get this done, but how can we sort of move forward on these things in a way that gets us somewhere? Socializing new issues, educating folks about issues that may be a little more complicated than you can educate someone about in 45 or 60 days. That's a lot of what gets done during the interim. But and the relationship building, with the brand new governor's office, I mean, the governor's office, even today, isn't fully staffed up. There's a lot of empty desks and a lot of empty offices, and there are folks who may have come in to sort of help get the place stood up and get people going, but maybe transitioning out and bringing on new folks. There's a lot of agencies that are not fully staffed, and so ensuring that you have the relationships with folks in those where, again, you might not agree with them 80% of the time, but there's that 20% moment where you and the new director of DEQ, for example, who's from Alexandria and has an incredible amount of experience in the area of stormwater management, which is a big thing for Alexandria. Knowing that Mike Rolband and I can have a conversation about, here's what we're trying to do, and I get that you all don't want to open up this section of code because it's a slippery slope and the home builders hate it, and the realtors have issues, but how can we solve this same problem? That's work that's done those other 46 weeks of the year, not during the 45 or 60 days that I'm there, traipsing around the Capitol complex.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up question since you brought up the importance of relationships earlier. I communicated with Mayor Wilson earlier today, and he said he never did get anything substantive back from the governor to his letter. He got a form letter. So then I asked him, do you plan on sitting down face-to-face and meeting with him? Do you know if the mayor has any plans to go to Richmond and sort of meet the governor and say, I wrote you a letter, I want to explain what these things are about?
I think that now is actually the right time to do that. In December before a January session, that's not I don't think that's a great time to get. I think now that we've all sort of got our sea legs under us, here's what this feels like, here's what this new dynamic feels like, here's who your staff is and who, how it went. Here's what we sort of learned from these 60 days, and here's how we can say, okay, like, we didn't really love this whole thing. We have grave concerns about the idea of cutting the gas tax and what it would mean for transportation funding here in Northern Virginia. We have grave concerns about, cutting the grocery tax. And while we support it in concept, if that money's not replaced, it has significant issues for K-12 education, for transit and transportation in Northern Virginia, and just for our piece of it, the 1% that we get. So when we sort of get through the budget and we get all these things, that will be the right time, I think, for us to all sit down and say, okay, here's what we learned. Remember that letter we talked about? Like, there's a real need for comprehensive tax reform in the Commonwealth. And part of comprehensive tax reform in the Commonwealth is a conversation about local tax authority. Working.
Let me ask Michael about that, because is that one of the issues the Family Foundation would care about, since taxes fundamentally impact the budget of families? Yeah. And in terms of, Sarah, once again, used the term the off-season, the other 46 weeks. Answer the question about the taxes if you can, and then maybe Mike can do that too, but also during the off-season, what priorities are you going to be working on? I mean, are you going to try to do some things that really sort of push back some of the, I'd say, the more progressive social contracts that were sort of struck during the Northam administration?
Well, First on taxes, yes. We're concerned about, I think we talked about in principle, the grocery tax. We think that should be trimmed, the gas tax if possible. I know there's a surplus of budget there. So what do we do with that? We personally believe a lot of that, if practical, should go back to the people. And so we are pushing that. We are hoping, to push some of those things, and we have been working on that, some of that behind the scenes. But again, in course of the year, like you said, those other 46 weeks of the year, yes, we're talking to legislators, we're talking to staff, we're having those conversations. For us, it's about building up grassroots, support for certain issues, educating people. For us, because we're more of a faith-based organization, we go to different churches. We talk to pastors about some of the issues that are going forward.
But what are those issues?
For us, there's, the issues of parental authority is one of the strong ones. We had a few bills that came through the legislature that we're happy with, but we think there's a little bit more that could be done in the next session. So we want people to understand what some of those issues are, how they can talk to their own legislators about that, because it's not just us, it's other people. It's the constituents going to their delegates and going to the state senate and say, yes, we would like to see more change on this, on these particular issues. So we do work, again, a lot of it's grassroots the other part of the year, but yes, we do stay in contact with legislators and their staff over the year. Yeah.
Say, Mike, we were talking earlier today before we got here. You mentioned the importance of sort of building relationships and being able to work on compromises with people to really get anything accomplished. And you mentioned that in your opening remarks as well. Do you have any practical examples of at times when the Republicans or Democrats have sort of gotten off their issue? An example might be, you can't cut the gas tax, you can't cut if the state has a budget surplus in excess of $1 billion, can't some of that money? In other words, is that sort of for you the kind of act of good faith you'd want to see from Democrats? And on the other side, what would you be willing to give them to sort of move the ball forward in terms of solving some of these problems?
Sure. Certainly I think that, particularly in this economic environment, I think we would be very interested in seeing, more of that surplus going back to folks who are struggling with, higher gas bills, higher, food bills, higher everything bills. Everything is really more expensive these days. So I think that certainly that's someplace where we would want to find some common ground. In terms of things we can give on, I'm not a lobbyist or a legislative assistant or aide or anything like that.
Yeah, but you described yourself to me as kind of a mainstream Republican. You're not necessarily in the Trump wing, and what could you see saying to Democrats, we can go along on these issues with you?
Sure. One of the things, and I said this at the beginning, was I really feel like that there are opportunities for us to improve the educational outcomes for lower income and minority students, particularly those who have suffered because of the pandemic and being out of school and so forth. I can't
include increasing funding for public schools?
Potentially, absolutely. Particularly if some of the charter schools that the governor is talking about.
But those aren't public schools.
They're not. They're not entirely public. But yeah. But some of the yes. I think that I would be open to more funding, provided that we had an understanding of what that funding was going to be for and how it was going to benefit folks and so forth. But I certainly think that there's opportunity there and I think the governor is, like I say, I think the governor is very interested in getting some bipartisan wins under his belt to be able to say, I am capable of that.
Well, let me ask you to elaborate on that opinion, because in previous years you've only worked with Republican elected officials who have been politicians, elected officials. Glenn Youngkin is unique in that he was the chairman of the Carlyle Group, and he comes to the job fresh and with any political instincts that have been tested by time, or wins or defeats. You've told me you know something about him and his staff. What advice would you want to give someone who's ambitious, as you said earlier, smart, which a lot of people say he is, and he has a very broad agenda? How would you ask him to proceed so he doesn't crash and burn this first year?
Sure. I think he's done a very good job in the first year. Some of the issues have come to him, and he's come to some of the issues, which I think are great. I really would encourage him to find one or two issues where there is some common ground. I think it would benefit him, and selfishly, again, electorally. I think if Republicans find that issue that can bring Democrats, onto their side. Selfishly, I think that makes us a more attractive electoral option, and I think he realizes that. So
Is there an issue besides education?
yeah.
And then
Yeah.
I'd love to quickly address education
sure.
if I
Yeah,
could,
yeah.
because this education is a great example of the difference between rhetoric and reality. I think the complaint against Governor Youngkin is that he's all about rhetoric and he really doesn't like reality. And I'll just give you examples on education. Of all 50 states, Virginia provides 49th most amount of funding on education. We are second from the bottom. Now, Alexandria supplements that because they say we can't educate kids with so little money. So there's a lot of money in the Alexandria budget that goes to education. Well, when you cut funds going to localities, you are cutting education. To say, well, we Republicans believe in education when we want to give tax cuts to people so as to harm public education, that's not a good thing. I'll just give you one more example. You want to talk about bringing people together? Governor Youngkin's executive order on the tip line to have parents call the state if a teacher teaches something they don't want to teach their kids. That has brought every single locality in Virginia together. Every single superintendent of every one of 130 plus localities in Virginia have all signed a letter telling Youngkin, get rid of that tip line. It's harmful to teachers. They don't want to teach under the fear that they'll teach something about slavery or the Holocaust or something that'll make some parent mad. And every single jurisdiction in the Commonwealth has asked him to rescind that tip line, and he hasn't. So he's brought people together, but against these controversial policies.
So one of the questions we have from the audience had to do with the budget and sort of exactly what's at issue here, and I'll try to explain that briefly, and please correct me, Sarah, if I'm wrong. That was the proposal to suspend the gas tax for 3 months. You got the proposal to, in some way, cut back on part of the local grocery tax, or the state's portion of the grocery tax, let localities keep it. The governor wants to double the standard deduction for individuals and couples, and he also wants to provide like a one-time rebate of $300 for individuals and $600 for couples as tax relief. I guess my question to you and Mark, as you've talked about this a lot, and once again, back to the idea of compromise and what you can give Republicans, is there any tax cut that the city of Alexandria could live with?
Oh, I mean,
or Democrats could live with, based on your experience in the legislature?
Well, I mean, I think from the city's perspective, I think the getting rid of the gas or the grocery taxes has always, the grocery tax is a horribly regressive tax. It is a tax that, you're literally taxing the thing that keeps people alive, that you feed your kid. It's horribly regressive. And so the idea of going away with the grocery tax is not something that the city has ever opposed. But if you're going to take it away, you have to replace that funding in a reliable, sustainable way. You can't just say, so right now.
But then you're not really cutting taxes.
Well, but you are if the money comes from a different route. So you're not really cutting taxes. You're probably right. It's coming from another place, but you're cutting taxes in that way that affects people in that manner.
Can I give you 2 taxes I voted against, Rod?
Yeah.
One is a motion picture subsidy. I didn't think motion pictures need a subsidy to come to Virginia. They'll come to Alexandria. It's pretty historic. Another tax that I voted against was a tax on women's sanitary products. I was like, that's pretty necessary. There shouldn't be a tax on that. And Republicans insisted on that tax. They wanted women to pay that tax. So a lot of this.
What happened in the end?
We lost. We lost. The tax is still there.
Okay.
So I don't think it's this idea that Democrats want to tax Republicans. It depends on the priorities. Most Democrats I know want to get rid of the grocery tax, but we want to make sure that you don't take it from our education budget. You don't take it from our police budget. Find us another way to fund those things, like the things that I think we can all agree on. Let's tax visitors to our hotels. Things like, one real thing about taxes that I sort of bring up because Sarah and I fought hard on this and we didn't win. It was $7 to be added to every lawsuit for a law library, because a lot of people can't afford a lawyer, so they get their information from a law library. And Republicans said, we don't want this extra $7. If you ever filed a lawsuit, let me tell you, $7 you won't notice. It's tens of thousands of dollars, unfortunately, to file a lawsuit. $7, and we said, okay, just let localities who want it have it, and they said no. And so, that's a tax that I think really wouldn't harm anyone and would allow people to have law libraries.
But I think back to the budget. I think there are some real clear differences. So what's interesting about the budget is the budget right now was not proposed by Governor Youngkin. It was proposed by Governor Northam. It was his outgoing budget. So it was his sort of, his wish list for all the great things, his sort of legacy budget. And then the House comes up with their version, the Senate comes up with their version, and then they sort of have to compromise and come up with what the final one's going to be. The House's version, as Republican-led House, is much more in line with the governor's priorities than the Senate's is. The Senate's is much more focused on sort of using all the monies to fund existing services. The House's tends to send a little bit more back to Virginians in rebates and standard deductions and things like that. But where those opportunities for compromise are, I think that's what we're going to see. And so I think it's adorable that the governor is calling the General Assembly back on Monday for a special session. They're going to gavel in, say, we're here, special session started, and they're going to go home. Because there's no budget. They haven't negotiated, they haven't agreed, there's been no compromise, there's been no decisions. And so it's not like calling them back into special session magically makes a budget appear.
Is there a deadline for when they have to have a budget passed?
I mean, the end of the fiscal year, but
The money runs out June 30th.
Right,
If
June
we don't get
30th.
it done by then, we're all in trouble.
and I think if you look at the budgets historically, if I'm not wrong, I believe the incoming governor's budget year is almost always, the last several governors, been a June budget. So it's a tough one to put together, and so I'm not expecting to see a budget anytime soon, which is hard for localities because we need to know sort of what the formulas are that are going to send money to us that are going to be funding our schools and our roads and our public safety and all these other things. So
Just real quick, Alexandria has $40 million in the Senate budget that's not in the House budget for the combined sewer.
We're running out of time. I want to ask each of you to sort of summarize a little bit, but also if you could address this, Mike and Michael. Sarah talked about the budget and sort of it looks like there's an impasse right now. Isn't one of the things on the table, at least I think from the state Senate Democrats, is not to do anything too hasty on rebates of money, but to form a commission to study it, which is a governmental practice, tried and true at all levels of government when they don't want to really do something. Do you see that as actually maybe happening instead of action on taxes? And if so, would Republicans support that in the House of Delegates, do you think?
I mean, I don't know. Sorry, I don't know the answer to that. I think that they would be much more inclined to, support the actual tax cut as opposed to some sort of can kicking exercise. But because the surplus is here and now, it exists now, and costs are high now. People are dealing with that now. So I think they would be disinclined to support a can-kicking exercise.
Okay. I want to start just closing remarks. Just a minute or so, because we are on a time schedule. Mark, if you had to look ahead, what's the one thing you think Governor Youngkin and his administration and the House delegates can agree about with the state Senate, sort of for the common good to move the state forward? What would you want to see them work on? One thing.
That's a tough question. I would like conservatives to be fiscal conservatives. It's fascinating to me that if you look at McDonald ran our budget way into the red, and it was the Democrats that brought all of these surpluses here. And conservatives tend to be big spending or big tax cuts. They tend to run our budgets into the red, and I find that the Democrats are the ones who are protecting the fisc and making sure we have enough money for a rainy day. The reason we have a surplus now is because we were very careful during COVID, and we made sure that we didn't overspend when we had all these incredible expenses that were coming out of nowhere on COVID. So because we handled the budget well, we have this surplus, and I don't mind giving some of it back, but I do think that it would be nice if conservatives were more fiscal conservative, and I think that's a great way to say to Youngkin, will you be fiscally conservative and not spend and run us into big debt?
Okay, we'll see what happens. Sarah.
I am a big fan of the idea that one-time monies, and we're not sure that the monies that are currently there are money that's going to be repeated over years and years and years. There is no better use of one-time money than capital investment and infrastructure. And when I talk about infrastructure, I really think there's an opportunity for some common ground here when it comes to school construction and renovation, when it comes to affordable housing, when it comes to transit and transportation, And when it comes to stormwater resiliency, especially inland flooding, an issue that the Commonwealth has not invested in either informationally or fiscally as a problem that really needs to be solved, and something that is very close to us here in Alexandria. I think, selfishly, those are all big things for Alexandria, but I think they are things that cross geographic boundaries, cross partisan boundaries, and really could be excellent uses of one-time monies to invest across the Commonwealth in people and communities throughout Virginia.
Michael, what's the one thing you really
One
want
of the
to see?
things I would love to see is charter school expansion here in Virginia. I lived in California for a few years. California has over 1,300 charter schools. Charter schools are substantial in DC, and substantial in Maryland, hardly, conservative playgrounds there. This has been a bipartisan issue. Virginia currently has 7 charter schools. I think that we need more options, especially up here in Northern Virginia. You have parents who, most people, 2-income families, they can't afford to homeschool. If they have issues with the public schools, which, to be honest, a lot of conservatives don't feel like they're being represented in the public schools, they have a lot of issues with that, that may be their only option, especially if private schools, they can't get scholarships for those. So we really need a good, robust charter school system here in Virginia for parents to have options. I think that will diffuse some of the school situation here on both sides, and I think it'd be good for a variety of Virginians here, conservative and liberal.
Would you want that to be left up to local control?
Well, this is how I would put it. I think there are locals should work on it, but I don't think it should necessarily be left up to local school boards to decide that. I would go with something like, you have a board or state boards or other regional boards that could determine school goals district. Because of course, it's obvious. If you leave out to local school boards, they're basically approving their competition, and you need a better way to do that. Yeah.
Mike, you get the last word.
Sure.
What would you like this year to sort of show good faith on both sides?
Sure. Well, Michael sort of stole my thing. I have been hammering this, the education issue. I have 2 young children. They're both in school, and I've seen the effect of the pandemic on them. And I think Governor Youngkin, really had his finger sort of on the zeitgeist of where things were when he came out for keeping schools open and, making masks optional. I can see the effect that masks have had. And so I think he did have a feel for that, and I think that the fact that he was able to get so much traction on those issues shows at least there's an openness to dealing with that issue. And so I agree with Michael. Charter schools is a really a great place, a great option for us to be pursuing, for him to be pursuing, and he is. And building up more of the governor's schools. He's really pushing to have, I think he said 20 governor's schools, which are public schools, like TJ, here in Northern Virginia, but having them across the state and really encouraging children. Because as I say,
A school like Thomas Jefferson High School at Fairfax.
exactly 20 more schools like that, but public schools. So I would love to see that happen, particularly given all the learning loss and all the challenges we've had over the last couple of years.
Well, I want to thank each of you for taking the time to be here tonight and sort of educate our audience. I hope they did that. Give them a round of applause. They did a really nice job, I think. Thank you, Mark, Sarah, Michael, and Mike. So that concludes our March program for Agenda Alexandria. Please check our website to see what we'll be talking about next month.
Thank you again to, thank you again to all the panelists. Thank you all for being here tonight. Again, thank you for bearing with us as we go through the technical process of getting all the microphones and going back to this, continuing to do this hybrid format. Our next program, as Rod mentioned, is on the website, but for those of you watching and those here, it's about surviving the cost of living in Alexandria. And just to read you a little bit about the program description, what does it mean for someone with no financial cushion, no resources, no health insurance, a paycheck that doesn't stretch quite far enough? Who are these individuals? Where do they live? And how do they survive? Join Agenda Alexandria next month at 7 p.m. here to talk with representatives of a coalition of city government offices, faith-based groups, and nonprofits who provide financial and legal aid, bridge the gaps left by Medicaid, food stamps, and SNAP program, negotiate medical and dental bills, share resources, and depend on a full host of volunteers to make it all happen. So please join us here next month on Monday, April 25th at 7 p.m. So we hope that you all join us for that. And with that, whenever you're ready for the credits, thank you again for watching.
This is Agenda Alexandria, a nonpartisan organization that takes a look at the issues without taking sides. Whether it's the city's sewer system, education, public safety, climate change, or perhaps a look back into Alexandria's history, Agenda Alexandria is here to shine a light. What makes the organization so successful is our people. The people who run it, our panelists, our moderators, and of course, our members. Agenda Alexandria is a member-funded organization, and we invite you to become one today by visiting agendaalexandria.org.